Hello. Hi, Mary Ellen.
Hello,
How are you? Good morning.
good morning.
Hey, I'm grabbing my cup of coffee. I'll be it's brewing as we speak, so then I'll be right back. But I'm
Oh,
Helen
okay.
Fallon, and I'm the moderator for the session.
I figured that. I'm
Okay,
just here early, so.
that's all right. So I'm not always trusting of technology, so I thought I'd turn it on a bit early. So
Right, I'm at my nephew's house because it has better connectivity, so.
great, and it's good to have nephews. Let me tell you that. So, I have no, I so you don't see me. I keep thinking, where's my photo? It's because I'm not logged in as myself. It's just like
Oh, I thought that was like a French fries box yesterday.
is well, it's a long story.
I figured that. I'm
There's a
like,
little torch that was someone created as a symbol a long time ago, and then
okay.
Cat McDonald created this little creature. So I'll be right back, Mary Ellen.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Mary Ellen King, and I'm from Frederick Community College. And today I would like to take you on the discovery of Frederick, Maryland's lost French heritage. And the barn you see in front of you has inspired all of the research that I have done on this. And it's a unique French hip style barn. Okay, how about we bring up our slides? That would be good. Yep. It's a unique hip style barn. It's the only one in Maryland, and it's located on the outskirts of Frederick on what is now known as the Monocacy National Battlefield. The National Park Service bought what was known as the Best Farm in 1993. When research began on the land and the buildings, it was learned that it was originally known as Le Hermitage, and it had been built by the French refugees in 1793. French had deep German and English Protestant roots. The the French Catholics were a real surprise. The Vincentiers who came and built the home and the barn were refugees from both the French Revolution and the Slave Uprising in Saint Domingue, which is now called Haiti. When they bought the land, the gentleman that was a relative of the family bought the land but put it into Victoire's name. The current theory is he did that so that if he ever got sued or his creditors were after him, the home would be safe. So when they left Saint Domingue, I know. The Vincentiers were refugees from both the slave uprising in Saint Domingue, present-day Haiti, and the French Revolution. The slave uprising in 1743 forced the Vincentiers and others to flee for their lives. The legend is they left with a barrel of gold and 12 enslaved people. They settled in Frederick, Maryland, and built a French plantation. The land for Le Hermitage was bought in 16-year-old Victoire Vincentier's name. The current theory is blah, 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 blah. Duboisneuf also lived at Le Hermitage. He represented Saint Domingue in Paris and was one of those who voted to guillotine Marie Antoinette. He also corresponded and visited with George Washington and others and others. It was home for a total of 17 refugees. When Victoire heard that a friend of hers was roaming and trying to find a permanent home, she wrote to her and said, come live with us. And her friend had 2 little granddaughters who also came. So why did they settle in Baltimore? Well, they wanted to replicate, why did they settle in Frederick and not Baltimore? Well, they did it because they wanted to replicate a Caribbean plantation. They wanted the close proximity to Baltimore, but they didn't want to be part of that community there. There was a Catholic church up here at the time, and it had a French refugee priest whose name was Father John Dubois, and he also was a refugee.
Hi, Thomas. This is Helen Fallon. You'll see me in a second or two. I'm your moderator for this section. Maybe he can't hear me. There it goes. You know, it is funny. I have to let people know what I'm doing here. Where's my other devices? Somehow, it must be Daryl. You know, someone else logged in too with the same one. This is funny.
I see.
Hi, Thomas.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Can't complain. There's Daryl. Hi there.
Hello.
I had to run and get a cup of coffee. That was really important. And there's Bruce coming in there. I was hoping so. Great. I know. Just needed this big time. And we're just waiting for one more, Kay Kelly. And then we're all together. I'm going to let Chris know, Daryl, that we're logged in, okay?
Okay.
Once Kay gets here. Bruce, good morning.
Morning.
Hey, how are you?
I knew I recognized a couple faces. Hey, Daryl.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Not bad
Excited
for a
about
Sunday
regional
morning.
history. It's always good to see history sessions at a conference.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, if things proceed apace, this time next year we'll be in Philadelphia.
I'm all right with that.
I think everyone is. I was so looking forward to Albany. My brother lives an hour away.
Oh,
And,
my.
you know, last year we were going to do it. And then I thought, you know, I was always holding out hope as an older person, Bruce, I'm already vaccinated. So that's, you know.
I've got one in. I've got one jab in.
Yeah.
I'm kind of watching all this going, well, I mean, so our plan at FCC is to open up 40%. And that means that they will be some classes on, I mean, there'll be one on-class session per week for a half a class. Or you can meet with half a class on Monday, half the class on Wednesday, some combination, and then the rest of it has to be virtual. And I'm just going to stay on virtual, structured remote. I've learned how to use Zoom.
Okay.
And they're not requiring any vaccinations or anything else. It's like,
Really?
It's
I don't want to bring it home to my wife. That's
Right.
basically it.
We've been a mix. Students had a choice from the fall on if they wanted to be on campus or remote. So last fall I had a class that I had almost everyone there and just one student remote. This time it's the opposite. I have one very loyal student who comes with me on campus. You know, that's why I said I'm not going to get anything because there's hardly anyone here. You know, I take from home, I take the bus into Pittsburgh. I call it my bus limo. There's like 4 of us on there.
Yeah.
I'm just,
I was going to say, I would never have done this before the pandemic, but I told my boss yesterday or 2 days ago, I said, and he was talking about, going back to face-to-face meetings next year. And I'm going, why? I've learned how to use Zoom. It's really efficient. It cuts down the travel time and, trying to get to meetings after class and all this other stuff. Why don't we just stay on Zoom for next year? And so I think he's thinking about it.
Well, I had decided I was done with full-time work. I'd had enough of the academics at my place, to be brutally honest. So then the next week, this all happened, and my chair called back. He said, "You want to change your mind and come back?" And I said, "Let me think about it for a few days." And I thought the answer was no. I'm just so tired of the politics. I could have kept teaching, so I'm just teaching a little bit and gave up the honors program. So, but still helping whenever needed, like this. I miss seeing you all, definitely. It's been a long haul.
Well, I think that's one of the things I look forward to, even on Zoom. It's like, Daryl and I were chatting yesterday. It's like, oh, yes, good to see you.
I think the students probably feel the same way. Thomas, you're in Salisbury. What's going on there? Where is that exactly again? That's on the other side, right?
Yeah, Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Eastern Shore.
Oh, you got Andrew as your director.
Yeah, I do.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Where
we know
is he?
Andrew.
Come on now. You better pop on this call. I keep forgetting he's there.
He had
Yeah.
a busy day yesterday. Yesterday was Admitted Students Day, so
Ah,
we'll hope he shows up, but who knows?
That hits every time with that university, because I remember even why am I blanking on his name? The previous dean
Dr.
there.
Buss.
Yeah. He always said it was always the same process. It was as if we had a vengeance on them, just that was it. So that's why you have extra people around. So
Well,
good.
it's even worse. One year they hosted the state honors conference. I think it was like 2014, somewhere back there. And it snowed. And it doesn't snow like that on the Eastern Shore, right, Thomas? Not
No,
normally, yeah.
it's once in a blue moon, but
Yeah, right. It snowed and closed the conference down.
Oh my goodness. We had snow here in Pittsburgh. I had a big project done in my backyard, and by 4 days after they did it, it was beautiful, it was sunny, and it snowed. And my magnolia tree was in bloom, and it's as dead as all those blooms are done. I saw Chris pop in here.
Yeah, he checks to make sure sessions are up and running.
Right now it's 80 degrees. Hi, Kay.
oh my.
Hi there.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, good. So we've got all three panelists here. Daryl, do you want me to moderate, or you want to help, or how would you like to do this?
Oh, you can go ahead and I will assist when you need.
Sounds like a plan. And it's really not that exciting of a job, but it's a fun job.
That's right. We don't have stinging buzzers or anything like that.
Right, and I don't correct any papers. I think that's the most amazing part of it, because even with just teaching one course, I teach. I'm a journalist, so I'm always correcting papers. There's some waiting for me at some point here today that I've got to get done. We're down to our last 2 weeks, and then yeah.
Well, good luck to all the presenters.
Right. What I suggested to the group yesterday is we just go in the order that you're in the program. And that means Thomas is first, then Mary Ellen, and then Kay. And your names are all easy to pronounce. It's Macaulay, though, correct, Kay? Macaulay?
Yes, that's correct.
Right, great. And what we found is it's just you can share easily. There's no co-host. That was a big lie from Zoom. There's no way to make someone a co-host with these. Who knows? But you should. I had no trouble yesterday. Did you have any trouble, Daryl, in yours? No, not at all. And I have 8:59 on my clock, so we'll give you each 15 minutes, maybe 5 minutes for questions so we don't miss it. I had someone get really into her history topic yesterday. I trying to make her stop, and I thought I was so glad we did questions in between, just because time kind of gets away from us, and we can go until 10:15. So with 3 of you, that should work out really well. What I'll do in the chat is I'll tell you when you have 5 minutes left, and then 2 or 1 minutes left, and see if you're winding up. Does that make it sound like a plan?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
I am going to exit the call and rejoin in a moment.
Okay, we'll wait for you. There you are. Were any of you waiting for someone to join us on the call? No, we don't see Andrew. Okay. All right, we may as well get started, I think, just so we can keep to time. And Daryl, you and I will be avid timekeepers here together as we go through this. So this roundtable is all about regional and local histories, one of my favorite subjects. My name is Helen Fallon. As most I know the two gentlemen, and should have introduced myself. I introduced myself to Mary Ellen when she was practicing there a little earlier. My study has always been journalism, and I'm a journalist still, but I have never met a museum that I haven't liked to go into. And I loved taking students on trips all the time because I always learn something, and I expect to learn something from all three of you today. So if you can very quickly, you can just type into the chat a little bio of each of you, and that way we can have a little record of who you are and why you've done this, and that'll be part of the recording. But we'll start with you, Thomas, because you're first in the program, and your topic today is wish they weren't in Dixie, Union Loyalists in Talbot County, Maryland. We'll let you get there. Stasia, no, nice to see her. See, there is a Salisbury person coming to hear you. And you can get started, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself and then just get into your presentation. But if you also put it into the chat, that's very helpful. Okay.
Already, is me talking about myself, is that going to be on the time?
A little bit, just a tiny bit,
Alrighty,
We'll make sure there's three of you. We should be good.
Alright, I'm going to share my screen now and get to the presentation. Is it up?
Yes.
Alrighty. Alrighty, good morning. My name is Thomas Long. I'm a senior at Salisbury University, and I'm presenting on Union Loyalists in Talbot County, Maryland. So Talbot County, Maryland is located on the eastern shore of the state. And in the county seat of the town of Easton, there is a very prominently placed Confederate monument in front of the town's courthouse commemorating 85 men who served from the county in the Confederate States Army. However, this monument leads to a false narrative behind the county, that the county was sort of a Confederate stronghold in the state. Well, on the contrary, it actually had its fair share of Union loyalists, being the elite landowners of the county, but also working and middle class white men who served in the army, but also those who had recently come to know their freedom, being formerly enslaved volunteers in the Union Army. So what I'm arguing here today is the fact that this statue perpetuates a false narrative, and something should be done about that to honor the true heroes of the county, being the ones who are loyal to the Union. So in order to really talk about Union loyalties in Talbot County, we have to address the Confederate sympathy in the county, which I admit was very high. As I mentioned, 85 men served the Confederacy from the county as they are commemorated in front of the courthouse. And this was also seen with a number of elites in the county. A lot of the elites of the county were wealthy landowners who owned slaves. So naturally, they likely were not to support the Union. In fact, the wealthiest slaveholder in the state of Maryland lived in Talbot County. So normally the allegiance for the Union within this socioeconomic group was not very high. In fact, amongst this group, there were only 2 votes for Lincoln amongst the elite of Talbot County. However, this did not really change throughout the war, as it was a border state. They were allowed to retain their slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. But at the end of it, this group tended to be favoring the Confederacy. This was also seen with the press. There was a newspaper called the Eastern Star in the county. It still exists today under another name, but this was led by a man named Thomas Robson, who was a flagrant anti-Lincoln figure in the county. He would always publish his opinions about Lincoln and the Union, and very much wished for Talbot Countyans to sort of rise up against. This was also seen with public figures in the county, politicians. An example of this was this man here, Judge Richard B. Carmichael, who was also very, very clear about his anti-Lincoln views. And he would allow some of his views to dictate in how he ruled in cases and everything. So, needless to say, there was a lot of Confederate sympathy in the county. However, a lot of this sympathy was ultimately dominated by Unionist figures. And this was seen in the case with both Thomas Robson and Judge Carmichael. Thomas Robson was actually arrested by Union authorities for publishing his opinions, and he was expelled from the county for the duration of the war. And this was also seen with Carmichael. While he and his state's attorney, who was also a Confederate sympathizer, were hearing a case, Union soldiers came into the courtroom and actually beat them up on the floor and arrested them and held them for a time, I think in Delaware in a prison. But this wasn't for the entirety of the war. But what I'm trying to get at here is that any Union sympathy, any Confederate sympathy here from these high profile figures tended to be met with Union domination. So now we must get to examining the Union loyalties in the county. And we first need to look at the elites of the county. So a lot of the elites that were opposed to seceding and were in favor of the Union were Quakers. Now, part of the Quaker faith is in opposition to slavery. And a lot of the elites in the county who were opposed to it, they were of this faith. Now, the most predominant Quaker elites that were opposed to seceding, but also slavery, were the Cogle family. Here are two members of them right here. They owned a plantation known as Lumberty, which still stands today. But Lumberty was notable for being a plantation that didn't use slave labor. Ultimately, it was unprofitable because of this, but at the end of the day, the Cogle family still was regarded as amongst the upper crust of Talbot County society. This is the patriarch here, Ezekiel Cogle, and this is his son, John, who actually went as far to serve in the Union Army. So yeah, I just thought that's really, it's standing out against the rest of their peers really deserves to be acknowledged here. Now, in addition to the Cogle family, I must also address the press in the town. The most notable press in opposition to the Eastern Star was the Eastern Gazette, which still exists today. But at the time, this was the most prominent newspaper in the county. And it made its Union loyalties very clear. It referred to Confederates as rebels and barbarians, and it talked about their acts of savagery across the nation and everything. So it's notable to say here that this paper portrays a Unionist approach to the Civil War, but not an abolitionist approach. Throughout the war, there still were runaway slave ads posted in the Eastern Gazette. So at the end of it, this paper was really seen as advocating the preservation of the Union, but not the abolition of slavery. Now, last but not least, we must address the public figures of the county who sympathized with the Union. And this was seen in a group of politicians known as the Friends of the Constitution, who were mentioned in the newspaper several times to go across the Chesapeake Bay to meet with other Union loyalists in Annapolis to discuss how to preserve Maryland's status as a Union state. So by and large, you can't really write off the elites of Talbot County as being predominantly Confederate sympathizing. There were notable elites here who did sympathize with the preservation of the Union. So now we have to look at a lower level of the socioeconomic stratum being working and middle-class white individuals from the county. So early on in the war, martial law was declared in Talbot County in order to prevent a Confederate uprising. But there wasn't really any fear of this by the time this came. There was actually a home guard that was established that allowed soldiers from the county, men from the county, to enlist and sort of keep the peace in their county and prevent there being an uprising. So this was actually widely popular with working and middle-class white men from the county who served and they got paid for their service and kept the county under firm Union control. Now, this wasn't only seen with the home guard. There was a draft from the county as well that pulled way more than the Confederate Army pulled from the county at the end. There was a draft camp here, Camp Hicks, in Easton. And this was in stark contrast to really what the Confederates were pulling from the county. The Confederates only had 85 people serving from Talbot County, while the Union soldiers, according to census records, there were 334 Union soldiers and widows after the war had taken place in 1880. This is the record when it was from. But at the end of the day, there is no monument for the Union soldiers in Talbot County. And this is because there was a staunch class divide with the families of the Confederate soldiers. The Confederate soldiers tended to be from sort of the upper class families of the town. They were wealthy farmers' sons, if not the farmers themselves. And after a war, a lot of this generational money continued over. So in 1916, that's when the monument was erected. A lot of that money was still there and contributed to their story being told rather than the Union soldiers being told. So at the end of the day, it tended to be a really big class-based thing, but also racism-based thing, being in 1916 to perpetuate a narrative such as this. Now, in addition to the white soldiers from the county, we also need to look at the service of African Americans, free and formerly enslaved in the Union Army. Now, early on in the war, enlistment and recruitment of African Americans was very difficult because of local laws across the Eastern Shore. And these local laws were mostly perpetuated by slaveholders who were worried they would lose their property, they'd have an uprising on their hands. And pretty much if you have the money, you hold the power here. So early on in the war, even though it was a border state, recruitment and enlistment of African Americans was very difficult and very rare. But as the war progressed, there was actually an incentive passed for slaveholders that they would be paid $400 per man to have pretty much what was their former property fight for the Union Army. So this actually became widely popular in Talbot County. The county became a huge embarkation point across the bay for African Americans to go over and train in Baltimore and everything. So yeah, this was a pretty big shift. So there were two main regiments that African American soldiers served from in the county, the 7th and the 9th United States Colored Troops. Mainly the 7th was what I studied for this. And the 7th was sent as far south as Florida, serving as labor for the Union Army, but also in combat missions. And they did indeed, a lot of them were captured at the end of the war. Not at the end, but throughout. And upon their capture, it was very clear that they were fighting a very different war than that of their white comrades. I have an officer's account that I studied saying that when he and his men were captured within the regiment, part of it, they were sent to this place here called Libby Prison in Virginia. And while he was treated relatively well, a lot of his men were not. A lot of them were sold back into slavery. A lot of them died of disease, and a lot of them were treated by surgeons at the camp in not a very orthodox manner. And unfortunately, a lot of them died at the hands of their captors. So it's very unfortunate, but at the end of it, these men were fighting a very different war than their white comrades due to the sense of racism that prevailed at the hands of the Confederacy. Now, not all of them did die in the war. A lot of them did come home to Talbot County. And the ones that came back to the area around the land of Ezekiel Kogel were actually given an award. Ezekiel Kogel leased them out plots of land at the cost of $1 per man, and they were allowed to form their own village and town, known as Unionville. Unionville was not the only case of this. There was also Copperville and a place called Williamsburg, all within Talbot County. But Unionville was the most notable. Unionville was thriving after the Civil War. There were shops, there was a school, there was a church, which still stands today. By the end of the 19th century, Unionville was sort of on the decline. It sounds like a lot of the residents actually wanted to move into Easton to actually have more business opportunities. But Unionville still exists today. The church is still established, and a lot of the descendants of these soldiers still live in the town today. So the relevance of all of this today is Unionville serves as the predominant remembrance of Union involvement in the Civil War. There were 2 or 3 markers in here commemorating the town and what it stood for, but also the list of its founders here that were provided with this land by Ezekiel Kogel. However, unfortunately, Unionville is way out of the way of the public eye. If you're going through Talbot County, the majority of what you will see is Easton, and Unionville is way off of the highway. So if anyone goes through here, they're not going to see these monuments commemorating the majority of the people that served from the county. They're only going to see the Talbot Boys Monument, which stands predominantly in front of the Talbot County Courthouse. So recently there has been quite a bit of debate over the Talbot Boys Monument. And this stems from scholarship like mine, but also the recent reckoning of racial injustice with the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So in 2016, the main debate was over should we keep the statue up or not, but it was shot down because there's also a Frederick Douglass monument in front of the courthouse, which was seen as a compromise by the town's legislators and council and everything. So it was shot down then. It was sort of like, yeah, we'll let you have yours, but they get to keep theirs as well. So there was no real sense of justice there at all. It was sort of to say that they're valuing both sides of the conflict over slavery, which, in my opinion, and a lot of others, is just simply, it's unjust. And as I said, in 2020, this really resurged with the murder of George Floyd. There have been efforts to have it taken down. As you can see here, there have been community efforts placed all around the town issuing for the removal of the monument. But in addition to that, there have also been a lot of movements in favor of keeping it. A lot of Facebook groups citing preserve the Talbot Boys, and there's signs for that as well. However, at the end of the day, those who are favoring that are favoring a racist and ultimately untrue narrative about the county, that the majority of its service was ultimately for the Confederacy. As I've shown here, the majority of support during the Civil War went to the Union. And this was in the form of the Union Army with its white soldiers and black soldiers, but also in the form of the Unionist elites. So in conclusion, I believe that they should have their own monument in front of the Talbot County Courthouse rather than those of the Confederacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was great explanation of everything and good solid research. So we have some time for questions.
Alrighty.
So Thomas, when did they start offering the $400 for basically to buy slaves and make them USCT?
That was later on in the war. I would say, I'm going to pull that up right here, but this was probably around, I apologize. I would say 1863. 1863 is when around that happened. So midway through the war, but that wasn't to say that there wasn't any at all. There were some that did enlist regardless.
Anybody
Anyone
else?
else?
Did that
Thomas,
at time, Thomas.
This is Bruce Thompson from Frederick Community College.
Yes.
Fascinating, great job. Really enjoyed that. And this is the value of doing regional history. You know, you can find the myths that are being perpetuated and make corrections. So you started to say in your presentation that they could sell their property to the Union, and you hesitated, you balked. And I'm just sitting here wondering, I'm trying to remember Maryland's status, but I don't think Maryland had to accept. It wasn't part of the proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't, I don't think Maryland was under Union rules in terms of getting rid of slavery or anything else. So
it wasn't.
I'm betting they were slaves, and I'm betting they were property.
I balked because I really cringe at the idea of someone being owned by another. That is the sole reason I balked. And it's I guess it's just natural. I apologize for the confusion, but I do agree with you that it was fully not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation, and these men, they were enslaved, and the people who owned the plantations, they were incentivized to do that. But ultimately, you are correct that they were their property.
Jessica has a question, and then Kay.
Yes, Jessica.
You noted with some of the upper class that they were Quakers against the idea of slavery and against the idea of owning people. Was that relatively common among the lower classes as well, or was that kind of a religion reserved for the upper classes?
Well, if you're a Quaker, regardless of class, you're going to be against slavery. Not necessarily against racism at the time. There is a lot of records that Quakers of the time did harbor very racist views. But as far as class goes in the county, a lot of the lower class white people would, as I said, a lot of them ended up joining the Union Army because they couldn't afford to own any slaves or anything like that. But also, this was sort of this attitude of serving Confederacy was reserved for upper and upper middle class white people. So, yeah, I would say not necessarily on a Quaker point of view, but a lot of the lower class white people of the county also would have not favored slavery at the time.
Okay, and then Kay.
Hi, less of a question and more of a comment. I appreciate your careful use of language when you hesitated. There is a more intentional effort in academic circles to refer to Black people experiencing slavery as enslaved people rather than slaves or property. And that just slight difference is a very intentional use of language to offer respect and respect the humanity of these people. So I appreciated that in your presentation.
Thank you, Kay. I wish if time weren't a concern, I would have gone more to refer to them as enslaved people rather than slaves. But yes, thank you for understanding on that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I also, this is Helen again, I appreciated your explaining very clearly when this Confederate statue was erected. I mean, that's an argument I have with people constantly. They said, this is our history. I said, this history came about not right after the war for most of them, correct? Have you noticed that in what you've studied?
I am very big on studying Confederate monuments as a whole and just when they were placed. And majority of them were placed around the 1910s and 1920s. Correct. Also during this period of resurgence of the KKK. So it all ties together. There is no really sense of Southern pride with this. A lot of it really did come down to reinforcing existing structures of racial oppression. The man who actually fought for the erection of this, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but he actually wrote a pamphlet on the history of the county, and he pretty much argued why slavery was good in his opinion. And this was all in 1916. So yes, it all came down to perpetuating a racist narrative.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I know Mary Ellen was practicing when I logged on, so I know you're ready to go, Mary Ellen.
I am.
And we can just a quick brief introduction. We'll talk about your future plans for all of you and where you stand in college at the end, but we'll let Mary Ellen go next.
How do I unshare my screen?
At the top of the pane, you should see
oh, here it is. Yeah.
a bar.
Yeah.
I'll stop it already.
There you go. There you go. Okay, Mary Ellen, you're next.
Okay. Oops. Sorry. I'm no good at going forward. Here we go. Okay, does that look good to everybody?
You're
Yes.
fine, and I'll give you a heads up at 5 minutes in, then you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Mary Ellen King, and I'm with Frederick Community College. And today I'm going to walk you through the discovery or rediscovery of Frederick's lost French heritage. What you see in front of you is a hip roof style barn, and that is a stone barn, and it is actually French in design. It's the only one in Frederick County, and it's probably the only one in Maryland. And the reason that that's there is because it was built there by a French refugee family. That is where this whole beginning of my narrative starts. And so what you see is what we're going to be talking about and the French that follow after them. So here you have the plantation home. And the plantation home was built by the Vincentiers. They came in 1793. And the reason they did is because they were escaping from the French Revolution and also from the Saint-Domingue uprising, slave uprising, and that was in Haiti, what we currently call Haiti. The family came, and the person who owned the farm was Victoire Vincentier, and she ended up being the head of the household. The reason we think she was the head of the household is because a relative of hers, Jean Péon de Wasneff, actually bought the land and put it in her name so that if creditors came after him, that they wouldn't get a hold of the plantation. Now, I know this sounds strange, they're going to build a plantation in Frederick, but that's truly what they did. So you saw the hip roof on the barn, and this is the house. If you look to the right-hand side of the house, you'll see a little addition added. Prior to that, the main house actually had a hip roof also, which is indicative of French building styles. Now, when they came, the local tradition is that they escaped from Haiti with the shirts on their back, a barrel of gold, and 12 enslaved people. So we've never found the gold, but we know who the enslaved people are. And when they created their plantation, they did it just as if it was a plantation in Saint-Domingue, and they had 90 enslaved people on there. They also took in refugees, and it was a sanctuary for those people. So they ended up with a total of 17 people in their sanctuary. Now, why did they choose Frederick? Well, they wanted to replicate the Caribbean plantation, and they couldn't do that in Baltimore. And they also didn't want to be really part of the lower echelon of people that were in Baltimore, because they were a higher level of an elite group of people, landowners. They owned several sugar plantations in Saint-Domingue. They liked the proximity to Baltimore. And the other thing that brought them there was the Catholic Church. And in the Catholic Church, they had a French refugee priest, Father John Dubois, who was also from France and by way of Saint-Domingue. Now, prior to the French Revolution, the state religion of France was Catholicism. So that's where they kept all their records. So when you go to be baptized, your record, if you are an upper class person, will include your grandparents' names, your uncles' names, anybody with theirs names. They'll actually sign the parish register. So Father Dubois' job was to create a new church, St. John's the Evangelist, and that was his mission. And that's one of the big pieces that we have in downtown Frederick. Now, in Frederick today, there was, back in the day, a large Catholic community. There still is, but this Catholic community was basically endorsed by the French and grew because of the French. What you see up here is St. John's Parochial School for boys. Then we have St. John's Church. And then down here we have the Visitation Academy, which is a girls' school. And then they had a free parochial school for girls. Over here, we have what is called the Jesuit Novitiate. The novitiate is basically a seminary or a theological college for young men who are studying to become priests. And the priests that they are studying to become are Jesuits, who are known as missionaries and educators. Now, when Victoire sold her plantation, which was about 3 miles outside of Frederick. She bought a home close to the church, and I have a star here, which indicates where that home was. They moved there in approximately 1828. To give you another perspective of this, what I have is what we see here, which is the Jesuit Novitiate, and they also had a cemetery back here. So you can see it was a large portion of land. If you look at the building, it's immense. Imagine that filled with young students, intellectuals, and just going about their business. It was a busy place. It was also an extension from Georgetown. Now, the Jesuits are those who were at, and still are at, Georgetown and Boston College and Loyola of Maryland, just to give you kind of a background there. Here is the church that Father Dubois built. The reason he built the church is because after the Revolution, they lifted the laws against Catholics, and they needed no longer to meet in homes, but they could build their own churches, and that was his mission here. The Visitation Academy started out as a small academy for young women. You'll see the ad down here, which says it's run by the Sisters of Charity, and it's for any religious denomination that want to come, just young people, young women who want to learn and read and write and know the basic in mathematics and a few other skills. And you can see this was a very big building also. Next, we had a community of Catholics that settled in 1789 in Emmitsburg, which is north of Frederick, and it's just south of the Pennsylvania border. When Father John Dubois was done with his mission of creating St. John's, he moved up to Emmitsburg, and he founded Mount St. Mary's College. And he was the president, and he was also the first president. Now we have over here, this is St. Elizabeth Seton, who was not born Catholic, but converted. She was very interested in Catholicism, moved to Baltimore, was part of that French family that was down there, Catholic family community that was down there. She had a benefactor that bought her 200 plus acres of land up in Emmitsburg so that she could build her school and create her own convent. And she did. And this is part of what she did. There was an order of nuns called the Daughters of Charity in France, and she created her Sisters of Charity based off their rules and regulations. And what you have here are the nuns who were teachers and well known for nursing. So this is the Civil War. They're in front of a tent hospital. And you see they have these big whippets. They're called cornets. And if you're older and you look at it, you see this kind of reminds me of something. It was also the inspiration for the Flying Nun back in the day, which was a 1960s sitcom type thing with Sally Fields in it. So what she did had ramifications in many different ways. Then we have other contributions that are in Frederick County. Over here, we have Lancelot Jock, who was from a Huguenot background, which means that he was Protestant and he had to leave France because he was persecuted there. He ended up coming and becoming great friends with Thomas Johnson, who was the first governor of Maryland, and they had business endeavors for 10 years until Thomas Johnson went on to become governor. Now next here, and we have one of the people who is half French, and that's from Victoire Vincentier. That is her grandnephew, and he was the 29th governor of Maryland right before the Civil War. And then we have present day current roots of the French presence, and that is the Delaplane Visual Arts Education Center. Now, the Delaplanes had a very prominent name in Frederick. They too were Huguenots, and they have been there for generations. They have a family fund that backs and promotes the visual arts within the community. So when we look at everything, we see that the mystery is solved, and basically it is solved because when we started out with the barn. The barn was on the best farm. The best farm, when National Park Service started to do research into the best farm, they found out that it was really a plantation called Le Hermitage, and they were rather shocked because Frederick has a strong Germanic and English background. So the fact that they had French Catholics in the middle of Frederick was pretty astounding. And from there, we went on and we see all of the different things that happen. Now, at one point, I mentioned the refugees who came from Saint-Domingue, and that Victoire reached out and brought people in. Now, some of the people she brought in was a friend who had two of her grandchildren. One of those grandchildren ended up being one of the Sisters of Charity, which is all connected in. And all of these people, they donated to the church, and they really made a huge impact on the community. Now, they were a small but elite group. We have two people who fought with Napoleon at Waterloo, who are buried in St. John's Cemetery. We have a Foreign Legion soldier who is also there, and several other notaries of French background. And that's a great place to look for people who are of different nationalities within the graveyards in the local cemeteries, especially if they carry records like the French did within the Catholic Church. So we come full circle. So we're back here, and here's our mystery. It's solved. We had French. They were very strong, effective roots. And in the end, we're back to our barn that is on the National Park Service. And it took the founding of Monocacy National Battlefield to uncover the French roots. And with that, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to field them.
Thank you very much. That was even ahead of time. Very good. I can tell you were practicing away, so that was really great. Some questions. You can either unmute yourself or raise your hand. And I see a applaud. Thomas, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This might be a little bit outside of the area of your research, but do you know about any French communities on the Eastern Shore of Maryland at all?
There were a lot of French communities on the shore in Eastern Maryland, because Maryland was a Catholic colony. It was established as a Catholic colony. And then because of the revolutions going on in England, it went Protestant, French, whatever. And so they got shut down, and they basically passed the intolerance laws against the Catholics, which is why they weren't able to build their churches. But they're on not Solomon's Island, St. Simon's Island. There was a Father White who landed with the Ark and the Dove, and that was primarily, most of those passengers were Catholic. And then there was a group of Huguenots that came in, and then there was even some Arcadians from Canada who got kicked out of Canada right before the French and Indian War. And then the last wave of people who came in were the French refugees and the people from Saint-Domingue that were escaping death from either the guillotine or from the slave uprising.
Thank you. That's very interesting. The reason I ask is I was going over a map the other day, and there's a little place called Frenchtown, which is not too far from where I live. So I was wondering.
Yes, there's definitely roots there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Thomas. Any other questions? My question for you, how did you become interested in this, Mary Ellen?
Basically, I'm a Civil War historian. I've retired, and that's what I'm doing. So I had at one point got laid off, and I had years of severance, and the best farm was just being researched into, and it's part of the Monocacy National Battlefield. And I did archaeology there.
Oh, neat.
So I was very privileged and blessed to do, basic archaeology. So I did digging around the barn. I did digging in the front. And as another piece, because this is a plantation and it's Caribbean style, they put their slave quarters in the front because that would display their wealth. Now, the people around Frederick were scratching their head on this because everybody in Frederick put theirs in the back. But that was a major find to have the actual cabins and the footprints of where the enslaved people were.
But you never found the pot of gold.
No, no gold.
No gold. Well, good for you. What did you do before you retired?
I was a senior IT infrastructure project manager.
Good for you. Good for you for doing this. It sounds fascinating. Just really does, to know all these different types of things. Okay. Kay, are you ready to go?
Just another comment, if I could.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see the hand.
Most Macaulay students are native New Yorkers, but my best friend in the college is actually a native of Frederick. She's actually from Middletown. So this is so exciting because I've started learning the history by being her friend, and I'm so excited to bring this back to my own school community and talk about what you presented on. It's so interesting.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm also an anthropology student, so archaeology is right up my alley, and it's fascinating. Someone who is a native New Yorker, though, is St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. And
Yes.
I believe we were actually I was born on the same city block as her in Staten Island. So we're from the same Catholic community. And I've always been fascinated by her history as well. She's one of my family's patron saints. So I'm glad you could add to that knowledge. Thank you.
If you're ever down here, you should go to Emmitsburg.
Good to know. I will definitely put it on my list.
You know, I've passed that so many times on my way to DC or other places. I know I need to stop as well, all those exits for Frederick. Great. Thank you very much for that, Kay.
You're welcome.
It just seems sometimes that hand does not pop up as easily on my screen as I can. So if you can stop sharing, then we'll let Kay get started. And I'll give you a little introduction about yourself. And then I'll give you a heads up when you have 5 minutes left. Great.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kay Kelly. I'm a senior anthropology student with Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York, and I'm interested in the intersection of law and government with culture and society. So I'm happy to present today on my thesis, The Irish and New York City Public Services, Unions and Ethnic Enclaves as part of the Regional and Local Histories category. This project examines a long and complicated history of one of the United States' largest immigrant groups, the Irish. Irish immigration has been heavily researched, but this project focuses on a more specific history, which departs from that broad story of the Irish in America. Rather, I was curious about the role of Irish and Irish Americans, because there is a distinction between them, in the development of New York City public service jobs, specifically within firefighting and policing. This focus comes as a consequence of current conversations about race, of racial discrimination, of present-day minorities, and comparisons to other historically marginalized groups, which at one point did include the Irish. The country is currently reckoning with the actions of the New York City Police Department, one of the oldest and the largest police force in the country, which often sets the precedent for policing elsewhere. And in my thesis, I also addressed the more local issue of the fire department of the city of New York and discrimination in hiring practices there. These controversies prompted me to look closely at these institutions and ask how these departments evolved to be white dominated and Irish dominated, and then also to examine some ideological contradictions in the culture of the jobs. I have limited time, so my presentation today will break down just the particular dissonance between the values of the poor Irish of the 1840s and today's, quote, Irish pride and its connection to white supremacy, and trace the racial politics of the past through to the present day. Here we start with an engraving of the 5 points. If any of you have seen the Scorsese movie, Gangs of New York, this is a notorious place, the lower Manhattan neighborhood that became synonymous with the word slum in 20th century New York. It epitomized the state of urban immigrant life in America: extreme poverty, disease, both as a consequence of urban overcrowding and also the health consequences of the Irish escaping the Great Famine of the 1840s. There was also intense rioting and gang violence like the well-known Irish-led Draft Riots of 1863. These were really tense times, and the Irish were the major newcomers to the city. To summarize this history, the influx of Irish immigrants between 1845 all the way up through the 1920s contributed to the rapidly changing social organization of the city. It's true that the Irish were poor and they were not considered to be ethnically European or white by the Anglo-Americans in power. The uneducated Irish were labeled as papist drunkards by anti-Catholic, anti-poor, anti-Irish leadership and media. Many of us have heard the slogan, "No Irish need apply," as a rallying cry for that historical discrimination. But it is at this point that a particular narrative diverges from that history, a narrative that is claimed by Irish descendants today. As this narrative goes, the Irish and their descendants worked hard and humbly for years, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and awaited their slice of the American pie. They climbed the ladder of social mobility from meager means and in spite of that discrimination and hardship. Irish Americans have come to hold elected positions, owned businesses, and they've really earned that place at the table. And that idea is emphasized in the dangerous work of policing and firefighting dominated by Irish descendants. That work is dangerous and it's romanticized, a heroism of this Irish working class. So that is an American myth, and a myth that persists. If one works hard enough and waits long enough, he too will earn the power to dictate the laws, to swing the baton, to become white, to protect his share so fiercely as to close the door of opportunity behind him. So how did we get to this where Irish Americans identify with whiteness and perpetuate racism in New York City public service jobs, but still cling to that identity of their oppressed ancestors? The Irish in New York at the time took up any kind of unskilled labor they could. As industry was growing, at the crux of the Industrial Revolution in America, ethnic enclaves developed within particular industries. As we know, many Jews and Irish women worked in garments, Germans in brewing. The Irish took up work as firefighters and policemen. These forces were just being formed at the time because society had never been so urban and so large, and so many other immigrant groups hadn't yet arrived in the United States, so the Irish were at the bottom rung. I should say, as a very large group. There were other minorities always present in New York City's history, always involved in these industries and jobs as well, but they could not move en masse as the Irish could. So at the time, these forces were not organized with the hefty benefits, good pensions, and healthcare we know today. At the time, they were simply brutish gangs for hire by, Tammany Hall and political machines at the time. It wasn't considered noble work by the society. And these jobs relied on the Irish enclave and the network to get access to these jobs. It was physical labor that was exacerbated by New York's rampant capitalist growth, which sometimes pit working class groups, poor groups, against each other in service of private Anglo-owned companies or of those politicians. Oh, just want to keep an eye on the chat. I don't know how to see it. I'll keep going. This process occurred in a time of great, in a time of great flux. The massive population increase felt threatening to nativist white Americans. The country was rocked by the Civil War, and thousands of African Americans traveled to New York, which the media used to incite panic. These compounding tensions were deftly used to create social and political us versus them. To us today, it seems contradictory. Native Irish people in Ireland at the time tended to denounce American slavery, both because they had for centuries experienced their own oppression and history of forced labor under the British, but we will not call it slavery because it was not. And also because the American slavery had a direct connection to growing British industry, which then intensified their extraction of labor from Ireland. So they were all tied together. So, but once the Irish arrived in New York and were thrust into this divided American politics at the beginning of the Civil War, political alignment shifted really quickly. Once Black Americans traveled north during Reconstruction and the Great Migration, the Irish Americans found way more security within the racial hierarchy instead of uniting with Black Americans and other minority groups on the grounds of economic or class unity. And their whiteness, the way that they appeared, and their relative closeness culturally to other Europeans permitted them to do so. So formerly enslaved African Americans and increasing populations of other people of color were deemed the new social danger. And the Irish Americans had power to gain from that pointing of the finger of this distraction. This manifested in strong unions in Irish-dominated jobs. And once the Irish gained control of firefighting and policing, they shut the door behind them. Once a means of secure, stable pay, now that they had these jobs, the unions became strong enough within them, reinforced by this ethnic unity, to leverage anti-Blackness to secure the job's exclusivity. Public services, once meant to serve all citizens, to serve and protect, were managed by these workers' unions, and now we're leaning into whiteness, and the unions protected this status quo. So on this next slide, I would like to warn a scene of a mob lynching. So just in case anyone is concerned. I wanted to include that what Irish Americans exactly did to achieve this whiteness. It was not passive, which is bad. It was even worse that they acted in very violent ways. These fears of racial economic competition informed how they worked, and they used the protection of being cops and firemen to legally incite violence or have beatings in the streets. We cannot simply blame the legacy of powerful English control in the colonial era in American history for white supremacy. Formerly oppressed groups like the Irish that adopted whiteness must also take on that blame. And this is an image of that 1963 draft riots, which were Irish-led. It was meant to be in protest for being drafted by the United States government for the war, but it was also out of some resentment for why should we put our lives on the line for Black Americans who will only come up and steal our jobs. This past year, our society more closely examines the origins of policing. It is now more widely known that police forces were founded for the purpose of catching runaway slaves and as opposition to abolitionist movements. Following abolition, police departments existed also to regulate the behavior of emancipated people, especially in urban areas. And importantly, they were also a government response to protests. This history contextualizes Irish participation in enforcing that racial hierarchy. The Irish eventually dominate the New York City police force with the power of political machines because of their experiences of the American military, and also just for that need for stable employment and a widespread resentment of other minorities. They were socially and economically motivated to perpetuate white supremacy by using public service and making those jobs exclusionary. My intention with this project is to point out that formerly oppressed immigrant groups were not blameless in their day, nor are they now. And their descendants rely on bootstrap narratives, those false bootstrap narratives, to justify the hierarchical power they now hold. History is far more complicated than the Irish worked hard, and why can't every other immigrant group do the same? Generations later, firefighting and policing, specifically in New York City, value legacies and keeping work in the family. So that nostalgia of the job, old Irish paddies banding together to violently whack around the Black people in a community to enforce the law persists today, and it dubiously clings to that pride in a heritage. So this is a quote from the history page of the NYPD Emerald Society, the Irish fraternal organization. They manufacture a memory of Ireland, which seems odd when we recognize that they are generations removed from this homeland and frankly retain little or nothing of Irish cultural heritage. It leans heavily into that nostalgia of the good old days, again, reminiscent of the status quo, very similar to dog whistle language we see for white supremacy. So today, I'm sorry, how much time do I have left? I cannot see the chat. Okay. Today we discuss the overwhelming power of structural and institutional racism and how that white supremacy serves the social status quo. Public service more easily falls into enforcing that and protecting that than breaking it down. So when public service employees are also personally on board and use the smokescreen of Irish heritage, it makes it all the more difficult to deconstruct and call out at its face. The language of Irish pride and statements like this dance around these pressing issues. And in the current moment, it's now unavoidable to note the resounding silence from this Irish fraternal organization and the NYPD and FDNY in dealing with their own discriminatory hiring practices, police brutality against minorities, without acknowledging the history of their own ancestors accurately. So I hope that my research will recontextualize Irish participation in one of the strongest arms of government-sponsored racism in these public service jobs. And I hope to bridge, rather than to just call out this contradiction, to bridge Irish American employees of these service jobs with this history, to make it approachable for them, and rather to create a conversation to allow them to recognize that history and to grow, rather than causing a defensiveness or a divisiveness between people who would like progressive change and these people who find their ancestry to be attacked. And as a consequence, I hope by changing that story, it'll affect the services that they are bound to provide to all New Yorkers and improve the quality of life for the rest of the city.
Still have about 2 minutes left if there's anything, because I know I'm sorry you couldn't see the chat throughout that, but if there's something else you need, it's okay. If there's something that else you'd like to add, you still have a couple of minutes.
That is all. I think if I get into anything else, we'll be getting too far into the weeds, but I'd love to take anyone's questions.
Yeah, and Thomas is first, and I'm sure that we'll get into some of those weeds as we ask some questions. Go ahead, Thomas.
Okay, first of all, I just really wanted to say this was a stellar presentation.
Thank you.
And felt like it kind of tied in our themes of false narratives and all that. I felt that really tied together. So I just wanted to ask, how common were the lynchings? How common were they?
They usually, there was consistent, like, daily aggression and violence among minority groups, especially in downtown Manhattan, because simply the overcrowding and lack of government control or regulation or assistance for people, and tensions were very high. And because the Irish existed as an ethnic enclave of, by the 1860s, 200,000 people, they were a significant part of the city population, doubling and tripling in subsequent decades. They were able to leverage a lot of that power, just having more manpower. Lynchings and racial violence, I think, always saw upticks when there were particular, like, historic riots. So lynchings wouldn't happen all the time, but during the Draft Riots and other perhaps union strikes, they would significantly increase.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Racial terror is one of the areas of study that I'm into, and the Eastern Shore of Maryland has a really bad history with lynchings and all that. So I was just really curious to see how common that would have been in a metropolis like New York at the time. Thank you very much.
Yes, the politics at the time evolved so quickly, not just because the city was growing and immigration was increasing, but also Manhattan was tiny. These ethnic enclaves had their own distinct neighborhoods, but they were only a few hundred feet apart. So as the city was growing and expanding, everyone was on top of each other. So things changed decade by decade. It's hard to generalize over, like, centuries.
And we have a couple of more questions. Jessica, want to go for next?
So earlier on in the presentation, you mentioned about discriminatory hiring practices and the phrase Irish, no need to apply. Was there anything that overt on the part of the Irish against other ethnic enclaves in law enforcement and related fields, or was it more active in the sense of violence but passive in the sense of employment? I don't know if that's a completely coherent question. I apologize.
An interesting question. No Irish Need Apply references when they were first arriving in America. But discriminatory hiring practices come about later. Most other groups weren't really interested in getting jobs in policing and firefighting. Also, Tammany Hall basically prevented it. It was a system of nepotism, not really based on merit. When the city reformed after like the 1930s and 40s and tried to implement a more merit-based system for these jobs, there are civil service exams for the FDNY and the NYPD. And on these exams, there are dubiously worded questions that reinforce certain racial attitudes and discourage other minority groups from applying to the job. In the FDNY, they also offer legacy points. So if you had a father or an uncle who was on the job, you get 5 extra points. And that will bump you from, in 2007, let's say, like that would bump you from 11,000th place on the list to maybe 300th, because the test is that competitive. So just your ancestry alone, nothing based on merit, will rather get you those positions on the job. So there's a movement now to reform the nature of the test, allow access to fire and policing education for other minorities that want to get on the job, and removing those legacy points.
Okay. Daryl has a question.
Yes, thank you. I was curious as to at what point do the Irish go from being a despised minority in New York to we come to the St. Patrick's Day being one of the biggest celebrations in the city? I mean, when did that happen?
So by like 1900, there were so many Irish in New York, between 200,000 and 500,000 Irish New Yorkers or people who claim Irish descent, that they were too large a force to ignore. And politicians at the time, who were both, Anglo descendant or Irish people that made it to positions of local power, realized we need to take advantage of the Irish vote and the Irish labor force. If we get them on the side, our side of, pointing the finger at other minority groups, then we'll bite the bullet and allow the Irish on our team because we'll be unstoppable. And that's exactly what they did. And it took, each decade there was a step forward. They started dominating the union labor in these jobs. They get Irish leadership within Tammany Hall, which also helps to appoint Irish leadership within City Hall. And then there are Irish mayors and just as many Irish people around the country to also support these leadership networks. Which is not to say that I like to generalize that Irish and Irish Americans are racist villains. The nature of this power structure permits all Irish and Irish Americans to benefit from white supremacy, and it is our responsibility. I too am Irish American, if you couldn't tell my ridiculously Irish name. It's our responsibility to acknowledge that and live up to deconstructing it.
Thank you.
Great. We're just doing pretty well on time because yesterday we got kicked out of our session, one that I was in, so I want to be careful. Thank you all very much for all of this. I do want to hear from each of you about your plans ahead, but I wanted to make one quick comment for everyone. If you ever get a chance, read a book called Out of This Furnace. It's based in Pittsburgh and it explains the whole immigration status. And I'm very interested in that because I'm a daughter of an immigrant. And it just went through the whole thing. First it was the Irish we hated, then it was the Slovaks, then it was the Italians, then it was the Blacks. And, and the narrator said, why can't we just get along? And it's a great, great book that if you're interested in history or any of that would really explain a whole lot of it. So maybe we can start with Thomas, what the time we have left. Thomas, tell us what you are doing and where you're headed, and then we'll go to Mary Ellen and then finally Kay.
Well, next year, as I've said, I'm a senior, so next year I'm going to be going abroad for a one-year master's program at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. While I'm over there, I'm going to be studying monuments of slave traders and other Scottish figures who were celebrated but tied to white supremacy, imperialism, and the slave trade itself. And I'm going to be hopefully using that research to recontextualize the false narratives perpetuated over there and hopefully lobby for the contextualization of the monuments or their removal. And after that, I'll probably come back to here and do law school in the States and be an attorney.
Oh, that'll be a great trip. I took students, the last overseas trip I got to do 2 years ago, we were in Edinburgh, and it's a fabulous, lots of narrative.
It's beautiful.
Just beautiful. So good luck to you. Mary Ellen.
Well, I'm retired now, so I'm just having fun taking classes. So I'm a Dr. Thompson groupie. So if he teaches it, basically I take it. I will continue to do that. I'm really interested in historical research, and I will probably, I'm thinking about it, pursue a master's in history just for the fun of it. So I volunteer at different places. I volunteer up at Gettysburg. I volunteer at Smithsonian. So I'm really into the history part.
Oh,
And then
great.
I have one thing for Kay, and that's, did you know that the Ku Klux Klan, do you know the 3 groups that the Ku Klux Klan is aimed at? It's a trick question.
I'd love to know.
Okay, so obviously the Blacks, then come the Jews, and then come those who bow to a papal authority. Who could that be?
Oh, yes.
It's the Catholics.
Definitely.
So, you know, and Irish Catholic, you have to say, we need to band together. I mean, you know, this white supremacy, when they get done with everybody else, you're next. So.
Absolutely. And that oppression and that danger to themselves and their lifestyle in the United States was absolutely true. The trouble comes when it's co-opted to oppress other groups in the future.
Right.
Just handed down. It's so upsetting when you think about it.
One could say it's a uniquely American hazing process.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, and it's, you know, perceived as that's my, you know, that's the way I get back. You know, that's the way I move forward, and I've witnessed it in my life. So, Kay, tell us a little bit about your next steps.
I am graduating with a degree in anthropology. Over the next year, I hope to, well, I've been hired to work in the Office of Executive Counsel to the President of the City College of New York, so working in the legal field within my school. Over the next year, I think I will continue working and volunteering with the New York City Fire Museum. I use museum studies as a fun hobby, and I hope to be involved with volunteer archaeology work in the future. But in the fall of 2022, I am hoping to apply to law school and also become an attorney.
Oh, good. We'll have to make sure you have to type the name of that museum in the chat. I made 10 trips to New York with students, and we're always looking for places to visit and interesting little side museums, you know, as well as the other ones. Daryl, anything you'd like to say here about the presentations before we close?
Just that I learned so very much today, and the importance of, I think Thomas said it, digging into these local histories and narratives, because they, you know, layers and layers of myth and unreality and just outright lies about the past. And I think that's something that we need to remember, that the past is shaped by people who live in the present. And so a constant reevaluation, reexamination, and exploration of what we were will tell us more about who we are. And so I thank all 3 of you for pushing us in these new directions, and to remind us that I think it was Flannery O'Connor who said something like, and this is particular to the South, but I think it can go to all of history. It's like in the past, the past is not past. It's not even the past. It's whatever we make it. So I applaud all of you for constantly, again, making us reevaluate what our history is. Oh,
and thank you very much for that. Thank you, Kay, for that offer too, and appreciate the email. I'm hoping, I'm fingers crossed, I go with another group where I don't have 10 students or 15 students behind me in August just to go see Broadway plays. So you may get an email from me as we go. One of the things that, and they were all excellent, and I love Maryland. I go almost every other week with a friend to the opposite side of Maryland, to Deep Creek, Maryland, where her family has had a cottage cabin for a long time. And we talk about this all the time. And one of the things I tell students is all the oppression, all the racial discrimination did not happen just in the South. We have to always remember that, and work like what you three have done is such a great reminder of it. And we really, truly appreciate it. And I love the fact we're recording these so that we can go back and look at these and use them as an archive. I believe, Daryl, there's still room for times in Illuminate for any of this, the journal, or is that deadline passed?
I do believe we are accepting submissions for the next round. And frankly, I'm trying to work on a podcast for different kinds of student research. So if you're interested, I'll put my email address in the chat, and we can talk about that later. So we may do a few interviews with people just, again, to keep this discussion going.
Oh, that's great. That's a wonderful way. I'm a huge public radio fan and podcasts. It's just a good way to get all of this. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of you who attended and listened to this. And I think there's a little bit of a break. Correct me if I'm wrong, Daryl, or anyone else. I think the closing ceremony starts at 11.
That is correct, yes.
So hopefully you will all go there to get your reward. And I believe what Chris told us yesterday about the presenters, you should have gotten an email with your certificate for presenting today. And if you have any issues, just contact the executive board of NRHC and we'll make sure that we get it. But it's been a pleasure, and I just have totally enjoyed this morning's session. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
See you, Bruce. So nice to see you, and Stasia, if you're still there. I wasn't paying attention to who was in and out as we went along.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We survived.
I know, my gosh. It's just like all the technical issues, and the one session I was in yesterday, we ran, one ran over, and I mean, it just kicked us out because that's the way Zoom will do things. So it's a little nerve-wracking as you're keeping time, definitely. But this worked very well, I think.
I think so. I think so.
Oh, I want to applaud NRHC because this was even better than the state setup that we have here in Maryland. We had a Zoom conference for the state, and it ran really well. But this was even better. So I'm sitting here thinking that I'm not a techie person. But how do I do this? How do I set this up? It's like, oh my goodness.
It's really, so really well fraught with tension to do these well. I did a statewide journalism summit last month, and oh my God, I wasn't the technical person, but I arranged everything and then just gave it to someone. And that's even like, my heart was in my throat most of the time because we couldn't do the breakout rooms the way we wanted to. It worked out okay, and I think you just keep learning.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, and Daryl was our guest speaker, was it the fall at the Honors Forum?
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
December. Yeah.
So we every semester we have an honors forum. So we figured out how to do it, but it wasn't this level. And so yeah, we're just homegrown, and we don't have an IT staff to run our Zoom. It's up to the faculty to run it themselves.
Well, at Point Park we have Schoology. We had Blackboard for a long time. I liked Blackboard, but a lot of people didn't. We moved to Schoology, which is kind of clunky. So we use that, and I hate Teams. I just detest it. It's just so, I think it's so Microsoft. It's all but they will not support us on Zoom. So you can use it, but you're on your own.
Wow.
They will our IT will support you. And the guys always tell me, if you have a problem, just call anyway. It's just an administrative thing, but it's all a learning process, Bruce. I'm telling you this, but we're
on Canvas and Zoom now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, but this is great, but it'll be so good to see everyone in person. Even though, like I say, as I'm not working full time, I definitely want to plan to come to Philadelphia next year. I've missed
Well,
seeing all of you.
I'm the conference chair for the Philadelphia conference, so
Oh, Daryl, if
Chris
you
is gonna
need
be-
anything, let me know.
Are you
Yeah.
going to twist? I feel my arm behind my back, Daryl.
Well, you Maryland people have it together, though. I mean, the things that you do, I have always just been totally amazed at how you've all operated. That Baltimore conference was such a wonderful experience.
It was. I think it's the gold standard.
Right. And as someone who ran one and then ended up running another one in Gettysburg, if you remember that, Bruce, after someone switched jobs and went off to Maine, would remain nameless.
Yes, yes.
That was just awful.
But also, I remember the Pittsburgh one, and you all were the model for the Baltimore one.
Yeah, that was a good
The idea
conference.
of having a collaborative team instead of one or two individuals trying to run everything.
Yeah, my first conference was in Philadelphia, where it was just one person, and I was the vice president then, and she kept saying, "You don't need to do anything. You don't need to do anything." And then it was like chaos. It was, you can't do that. And my husband was from Wilmington, Delaware. My in-laws lived right outside of Philly. I was there all the time. I could have definitely helped any way, shape, or form. You have to have help. You have to.
And I'm glad you said that, because Daryl, I'm not officially with the NRHC leadership capacity or anything else, but if you need some help with Philadelphia, you have friends in Maryland. So
thank you, my friend.
just reach
And
out.
even went out.
Don't you want to be a member of the executive board, Bruce?
He
With all
served
my
his
free
time.
Daryl. I need to retire so I can do that.
It's the truth, and I will tell you though, Bruce, just trying to retire and try to get this done, because this is just such weird times. It just really, really is. It's hard to find. I'm putting too much of myself in courses, and that's the issue. It's just what you have the time. So, now I can do this.
We're all having to do that right now. I mean, I routinely work 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for sure, usually 7.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just because I'm department chair, honors coordinator, and I have to teach classes.
It's a lot.
Yes.
It's a lot.
Yeah,
Well,
the conference is sort of my break this weekend. And I got to get back to work at noon. So it's
Good.
Are you
All
all
right,
going to
Jim.
Orlando? Anybody going to Orlando? I'm really debating on whether to do it or not.
well, I'm a member of the board now, so I'm sort of
Oh, well, you have to go.
do have to go. Yeah.
I want to talk to them, because I assessed a program here in Pittsburgh. I really did enjoy doing that. I thought maybe I'm going to look into it. I was going to ask Elaine about that. I don't know what the process is for getting on the NCHC list of reviewers, but I'm going to look into that. Yeah, I learned so much just going to this one, and I think helped the person here in Pittsburgh to get their program. They had a budget of like nothing and no help. I mean, and this provost is promising also. I said, you can't do that. That's one of the reasons why I stopped last year, because I couldn't get Point Park to give me any staff help. It gets to be too much. It just does.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally got half.
I am a reviewer, and I took the training, I want to say in 2016, something like that.
Did you like it?
So if they ever offered the training again, and Daryl, since he's on the board, can find out easy enough.
Yeah, and I can reach out.
That's the thing. You just got to take the training.
Okay, I'm gonna take a look at that.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, see you at the closing.
Indeed.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Oh, this was great.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Really
Always
fun.
learn. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.